Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this event on India's election and what it says about the country's place in the world. My name is Dr. Kshitij Bajpai. I am Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at Chatham House. So 2024 has been referred to as the year of elections. We have a record number of countries going to the polls. South Africa is holding its election today. I'm based in the UK, which has just announced that it'll be hosting elections on the 4th of July. And of course, there's the US election in November. However, I would argue that the mother of all elections is taking place in India at the moment. And there are two reasons for this. First, of course, is the sheer scale. As the world's largest electoral exercise with 970 million registered voters, polls taking place over 7 stages across 6 weeks. The 6th phase took place earlier this week. And the election is also important from a political perspective, as it's likely to result in the 3rd consecutive term for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a feat that's only been achieved by India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Modi's party, the BJP, has defied the norms of Indian politics, which favor anti-incumbency and shaky coalition governments, which is what has existed for over 2 decades before Modi assumed power in 2014. The election also comes at a time when there's been growing scrutiny on the state of India's democracy and growing attention to India's rising global status. So to discuss this, we have an excellent panel of speakers with us today. Joining us from India is Ambassador Kanwal Sibal. Ambassador Sibal has served as India's foreign secretary, as well as ambassador to several countries, including Russia, France, Egypt, and Turkey. He's also served on India's National Security Advisory Board, and he's currently Chancellor of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Also joining us from India is Suhasini Haider. Ms. Haider is diplomatic editor at the Hindu newspaper. She's an award-winning journalist who's worked with CNN and CNN IBN. And then finally joining us from London is Dr. Pavitra Suryanarayan. She's assistant professor in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And she was previously an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. So what we'll do is we'll start with a guided discussion for the first 30 minutes or so before we open up to audience questions. So feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box over the course of the event, and I will direct them to the relevant panelist on your behalf. This event is going to be on the record, and a recording will be posted on the Chatham House website. So let's get started. We will discuss, of course, the specifics of the election, but I wanted to first perhaps set the scene by discussing India's place in the world. And on that, I wanted to start with you, Ambassador Sibal. Sir, you've served as Foreign Secretary under the previous BJP government of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So looking at that government and looking at this one, how has, in your opinion, India's foreign policy changed? Where do you see the continuities? Where do you see the changes? And to what would you attribute these changes? Is it Modi? Is it the strengthened mandate of the government, or is it because of changes in the international system? I assume it's a bit of both.
I think you're right. It's a bit of everything that you mentioned. Foreign policy cannot be static. It has to respond to the changing global environment, what happens in our neighborhood, the shifts of power within the global system, the conflicts that occur elsewhere in the globe, which impact on India and other countries too. And then, of course, India's own economic rise gives us more options in terms of our external relations. And the change in geopolitics also has opened up possibilities of establishing ties with countries with which we've had difficulties in the past. I mean, the end of the Cold War and everything else. That is one. The other is that in a big country like India has a certain continuity of foreign policy. I mean, small countries may be able to, because of their vulnerabilities and security issues that they face, can make big changes in their foreign policy and align themselves to big powers to protect themselves, etc., etc. But India is not in that category at all. We have a certain image of ourselves, our role in the world, our civilizational heritage. What we feel is our right to have more say in international governance. As you know, we've been pressing quite hard for permanent membership of the UN Security Council, though I don't think it's going to happen in the foreseeable future. So from Vajpayee's time and through Manmohan Singh and then to Prime Minister Modi's time, there has been an essential continuity, which is that India will not be a member of any military alliance. It will maintain what you might call strategic autonomy or multiple choices or be friends with everyone. I mean, these are different ways of defining what we have in mind. Basically, to maintain our wide options, the only course is to have friendship with all, to the extent that it is reciprocated. Now, with China and Pakistan, this has always been very difficult, but with the others, we've always maintained, as far as possible, constructive, positive, forward-looking ties. But what Prime Minister Modi has done, which is different from the past, are a few things. One is because India's economic rise has given us more options. He's much more confident on the global stage. He has been very active in terms of our diplomacy. He's traveled as no other prime minister in the past has done. He's had summits with all the global leaders as well as regional leaders. He has put a lot of emphasis on marking the international scene with India's civilizational ideas. And the G20 actually represented that. If you look at many of the ideas that figure in the G20 communique, these are India's civilizational ideas. And the other thing which he's done, which has been a source of controversy, is that he's not afraid or reticent about identifying himself with Hinduism. Because he feels that India as a Hindu country can play a role on the global stage more effectively and mark the global scene more effectively with the civilizational heritage, though there has been a consequence of this in terms of what some others think about the direction of India's internal policy. So he's not apologetic about being a Hindu. These are some of the changes, if you like, that have occurred. But essentially, there is great continuity in our foreign policy from the time of Prime Minister Vajpayee to Prime Minister Modi through the Manmohan Singh government, which is essentially a Congress government.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibal. We'll pick up on some of these points, particularly the issue of the extent to which ideology matters in making foreign policy. But perhaps I can turn to you, Suhasini, on the question of how much does foreign policy actually matter in this election. So I think historically, foreign policy has not really been a key electoral issue in Indian elections. But Modi seems to have made Indians care more about India's place in the world. We saw this in the 2019 election, where national security was a key theme following the Pulwama terrorist attacks in Kashmir earlier that year. This year's election obviously comes in the aftermath of India's G20 presidency last year. So do India's foreign policy accomplishments, its G20 presidency, its space program, does this sway the Indian voter, do you think? Or is the election really dominated by more bread and butter or livelihood issues?
Well, you know, one would think from what the government and the ruling party did at the beginning of the election campaign, one thought that they would really be talking about their foreign policy successes, the idea that India has pushed back against the West when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Russia's actions in the Ukraine war, the fact that India has shown a certain amount of strategic autonomy, or that Prime Minister Modi himself is respected around the world. And, you know, there have often been speeches about the idea that Mr. Modi has intervened to stop the war between Russia and Ukraine, at least long enough to get Indian students out of Ukraine, if not for a longer period. In fact, Mr. Modi, in one of his interviews, actually referred to it and said that many don't know, but I sent a special envoy to Israel. I presume he was referring to the National Security Advisor who had visited Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in March, I think. And Prime Minister Modi said in this interview that I told him to tell Mr. Netanyahu that not to fire during or to carry out the bombardment of Gaza during the month of Ramzan. Of course, Mr. Netanyahu did no such thing. He continued his bombardment regardless, and the Ramzan ceasefire never really fructified. But the fact that they are trying to get a bump off what they see as foreign policy successes, the G20 hasn't been mentioned quite as much. That's what we had thought at the beginning of the election campaign. But as the election campaign has moved forward. It doesn't seem to be, and I'm going anecdotally because I'm dependent on colleagues who are in other parts of the country bringing in reports. It doesn't seem as if these are the big issues. The economy remains a major issue, the joblessness, unemployment, the higher prices, inflation, the failure of certain stocks, these of grain crops. These are certainly some of the issues we're hearing much more about, particularly in the past few weeks. On the campaign itself, as Ambassador Sybil said, Mr. Modi is certainly coming out very clearly, making it extremely clear that he is not shying away from the idea that he stands for Hindus, that he has now I would figure at least 20 to 25 rally speeches that we have documented, spoken against the idea that Muslims should get any part of any extra quota from the government, and claims that the Congress party is trying to do that. But in there's been a lot of anti-Muslim sort of rhetoric coming out of what he is saying. And it does seem as if the communal issue is also pretty large over this election campaign. I do think that the fact that the government thinks it's done well in a decade on the foreign policy front is something they took going into the election to show some of their successes. I'm not sure it's been as much a part of the election campaign as we had perhaps thought, nor a part of possibly what will be the results next week.
Thank you, Suhasini. And on that note, let's get into the election. Pavitra, so how would you assess the conduct of this election? There have been some concerns about a lower than anticipated voter turnout, although I think that's been somewhat exaggerated. There's also been concerns about delays and discrepancies in the release of poll data, instances of some use of inflammatory language on the campaign trail, and allegations that the government has essentially been pursuing a witch hunt against the opposition by employing institutions like the Enforcement Directorate. So, can this election be regarded as free and fair? Has there been a level playing field, in your opinion? Pavitra, I think you're muted.
So I want to say a couple of things. The first is, going into the elections, there was a great deal more bluster from the current government than how the elections have actually played out over the past month and a half. And so, early on in the election, we heard this rallying cry of this time more than 400 seats for the ruling party, right? And I think as the elections have gone on, we see that this is a much more competitive landscape. And in some ways, I think it's a reversion to how elections have been fought for several decades. So in that sense, 2019 and even 2014 might have been the anomaly. And what we're hearing now is that these are much more being fought on a local level and state by state. Now, in terms of your question about free and fair, I think we have to look at it as a part of a larger piece. Over the last few years, we have seen, this government really show its muscle against the press. We have a much more muted press than we did in the years preceding. And these are borne out by how even the world looks at, press freedoms in India today. The second is that the government has really tried to take charge of long-standing institutions. Universities are some, its tenuous sort of relationship with the Election Commission now is another. And so all of these have made us wonder, is what is happening really free and fair, right? And I think we shouldn't just overtly focus on the electoral aspect. We need to think about what it takes to have free and fair elections on the whole. So is the use of the Enforcement Directorate to muzzle the opposition? Is the use of force to sort of curtail the press? Is all of that leveling the landscape? But despite all that, I have to say, the center pin of the campaign right now of the opposition has been really focusing on rural distress, employment issues, economic issues, fighting this state by state. And I think things are going to be a lot more competitive than we anticipated. And the Indian voter really takes their electoral sort of duty very seriously. And we see that from reports in the field. And I have to say, there's one other thing that's happening right now, which is it's a very, very hot summer. So how much of the electoral turnout is a function of weather and how hard it is to vote in this extreme heat cannot be underestimated. So, we have to take the turnout figures more also of, possibly responding to changing weather patterns.
I think, yeah, all very good points. But I mean, just picking up, maybe taking a step back and looking at the question of the state of India's democracy under the Modi government. I mean, there's been a lot of allegations in the West of India becoming an electoral autocracy and a illiberal democracy. Even within India, Congress Party President Mallikarjun Kharge has said that democracy will end if Modi returns to power for a third term, and that the country is in the midst of an quote unquote undeclared emergency, so on par with, say, perhaps the state of emergency that existed in 1975, which was declared by then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. So, how much substance is there in such statements, in your opinion? I mean, it seems to me, frankly, that it's an exaggeration on some of these claims that we're seeing the death of Indian democracy. But what are your thoughts on this?
So I think one way to think about this is how much is the field tilted in the favor of one party? So if we think about electoral bonds or press or the use of federal institutions to reinforce and show their muscular power, the current party has been quite successful. So all of those are indeed alarming signs, and we should not underestimate them. Having said that, I think India truly is a federal democracy. So the answer to this question will depend on whether you're a voter in Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Delhi, or Uttar Pradesh, or Maharashtra. And if you go to each of these states, you'll probably get a slightly different picture of how vibrant the opposition is, how hopeful voters are in terms of being able to truly decide who they want in power, right? So I think India's federal politics have been somewhat of a bulwark against the sort of weakening of some of these long-standing institutions. But I would not say that these are exaggerated and that these institutions truly do matter. I think it's important to not just have one party in town, but to have multiple parties that are well-funded and able to give us alternatives in an electoral landscape. That there has been a misuse of institutions in trying to bully the opposition, and there has been a muzzling of the press, right? And so I think each of these things should be taken seriously. But they should not be a way for voters and parties to give up and sort of, clear the field to make one party even more powerful. And so to that extent, I think the elections underway are very competitive. And I think, we'll learn next week just how competitive they've been. And, you started this talk by saying it looks like they might have a third term. I would say let's wait and see what the Indian voter has to say about that.
Oh, well, on the question of checks and balances, perhaps I can come to you, Suhasini, and we'll come back to the question on the possible election outcome. But there has been concern, as Pavitra has noted, about the degree to which we see self-censorship setting in India's media landscape. The latest report by Reporters Without Borders noted violence against journalists, internet shutdowns, the concentration of media ownership in companies that maintain close relationship with the government. As a prominent journalist based in India, how would you assess the media environment? Is the scrutiny justified? Do you find yourself having to, say, pull your punches or hold back on certain issues?
I think Ambassador Sybil will attest to the fact I don't pull my punches. The truth is that this is a difficult question. It's a time in the world where India is one of several countries where we are seeing the press going through a very, very difficult time. There are countries across the world, and the US included, where we hear politicians, people in positions of power, really denigrating the press and really cutting off access, prosecuting journalists on the smallest of issues, putting them behind bars, threatening them with raids, and all the rest. I don't think that, I don't think India has, been any different from all of those countries. And certainly in the last 10 years, we have seen the Modi clamp down in various ways on the press and making it very clear that they believe that the media has been unfair to them, that they believe that the media is not the only way they intend to reach out to the Indian public. In general sense, keeping access as a great leverage, in a sense, to ensure that the press behaves behaves itself, quote unquote. I think there's a larger issue here. And since we are discussing foreign policy and what will happen in the world, I honestly don't think these concerns as they are expressed, whether they're by international ratings agencies or other governments, are in themselves going to change India's foreign policy or change any country's bilateral ties with India. We've certainly not seen them change in the last 10 years. But I think there are other aspects of what is called democratic erosion or the decline of democracy. Because obviously we're not just talking about democracy being elections, but how a government behaves after they have won those elections. And I think that there are 3 or 4 areas where we are seeing a definite impact of the decline of democratic values inside the country on foreign policy. One is on this idea of shared values and coalition of democracies, although frankly, it's not like there are a lot of countries out there that are in any position to judge anymore. The double standards of various countries when it comes to dealing with one democracy over another seems to have become quite evident, particularly in the last few years. Even the idea of the rule of law principle, which used to be sacrosanct in many Western coalitions, we don't see so much of that anymore. And I think post-October 7th and the way the West has really turned a blind eye to much of what Israel has done in Gaza, compared to the kind of noises that we had heard out of the West when it came to Russia's killing of civilians in Ukraine, or the rule of law question, or listening to the UNGA and all of that. I think a lot of those moral positions have been done away with, particularly in the last few months. Where I think they'll make the difference is on things that happen in terms of India's declining democracy that has an impact on other countries internally. One would, of course, be, and I think you mentioned the NGO sphere, the idea that in the last 10 years, practically every international NGO that used to function and operate in India has now been shut down, basically through using the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act, the idea that they can't get funding from abroad or that funding is suspended. So you can name it, whether it's Greenpeace, whether it's Amnesty, whether it's Oxfam, whether it's Human Rights Watch, all of them had offices, and, Compassion International, many other NGOs were working out of India. In the last 10 years, they have basically shut shop in India. You can't name a single international NGO in that sense that works on the issues of climate change, that works on the issues of child labor, and many other Christian charities that now actually operate in India. So I think those have a certain impact in their origin countries. The US government, for example, has raised the question, one on Ford Foundation, on the National Endowment for Democracy, on the strictures over CDC, or the strictures over the DOD's DTRA, that sort of thing. So that's one area. And then the other, I think, is what we've seen in the last year, the growth in concerns from certain countries over attacks on their citizens who are of Indian origin, essentially Khalistani Sikh separatists wanted on terror charges in India, such as the killing in Canada, and the accusation that Indian agencies were behind somehow the targeting of a gentleman in the US as well, who is a US citizen. Now, he's wanted for terror charges in India, but because he is a US citizen, the US has taken this up quite strongly. And I think it is having an impact in the relationship itself. We've seen many very high level visits, perhaps being put off for the moment over that. The third area I would say is the image of India. I don't doubt for a moment that India is intrinsically a democratic country. It is a democracy is truly in the DNA of Indians. You can go across the length and breadth of the country, and there is nobody, of any economic strata. There is nobody who's willing to give up the idea of their right to vote, or their idea of their right to change a government or to hold a government accountable. Even so, it isn't just a democracy that India has built its reputation on in so many decades. It is a democratic, pluralistic, and rule-abiding power. If it seems as if it is straining on any of those fields. The democratic part, the pluralism that India has been so well known for, as well as for being a rule-abiding power. And if you go by some of these allegations, that would also have come into some question. I think that's where you might see an impact.
Excellent points, and I should add that this is a good promotion for a research paper that Chatham House recently put out, looking at the link between India's status as the world's largest democracy and its foreign policy and relations with the West. I do want to get on to foreign policy and return to Ambassador Sibal, but I just had one more question for you, Pavitra. On I agree that I'm not fond of engaging in crystal ball gazing, particularly as we're not going to see any exit polls until the 1st of June. But as I said at the outset, it does seem to me that a third-term Modi government is a foregone conclusion, and really the key watch point will be the strength of the mandate that the government is able to secure. My question is, do you concur? I mean, do you see any possibility, say, of a repeat of the shock result that we saw back in 2004 when the previous BJP-led NDA government was defeated? Alternatively, what are the implications of the various scenarios where the BJP does return to power? So for instance, coming in with over 272 seats to form a government, but less than the 303 that it currently holds, or above the 303, but less than the 370 that its target that it's set for itself. Could the Modi brand be dented to a degree if it fails to fulfill its pledge of, is baar 400 par, we will, get 400 seats? Would it make it more beholden to coalition partners within the NDA or members of the Sangh Parivar? So, how do you see, again, with the understanding that we don't want to engage in too much crystal ball gazing before we get the election result, but how do you see the likely outcomes of this election at this stage?
So I want to reiterate, I've just been in India. I spent 6 weeks sort of traveling through the country. And again, the election really seems to be a state-by-state question. Right. So in states like Maharashtra and Haryana, there seems to be quite an anti-incumbency sort of sentiment. And if these are states that the BJP underperforms in, then it stands to lose quite a sizable number of seats. Same is true for even people walking through Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, where they've done reasonably well and in UP, they've done really well in recent years. And here again, the big issue seems to be rural distress. There seems to be reports coming in from the ground about the lack of employment, and what the ruling party's solution to that has been to really lean into welfare schemes that do direct transfers to voters, with Prime Minister Modi being the key sort of giver of these welfare schemes. And it seems to be that has sort of reached its potential. Voters are looking for jobs, and they're looking for investments into public and merit goods like education and health, and opportunities to really use their skills, right? But how much of that will translate into anti-incumbency is the big question. So let's say I think there are 3 scenarios, some which are more likely than others. So I think there is a scenario in which you have a coalition government, but one that's not helmed by the BJP, which would be like the surprise of what happened in 2004. There's one where there is a weakened BJP in a coalition government. And then there's one where you have a repeat of something like 2019, where the BJP comes in on its own mandate and greatly strengthened by its NDA partners. Now, what happens in that in-between scenario, right, where the BJP comes back, but it's somewhat weakened, could go in 2 ways. You could see the BJP come back and try something even more draconian, thinking that it hasn't gone far enough in trying to consolidate its power, and really using that opportunity of being back in power, even with a smaller mandate, to really consolidate. Or it could mean a BJP that actually listens and says, okay, maybe we have gone a bit far out. We really need to listen to some of our coalitional partners and revert some of the things we've done. My sense is the former than the latter, because of who helms the party, right? The party really has been remade in the image of Prime Minister Modi and his right-hand man, Amit Shah. And how they will be willing to delegate and dole out their power is a big question, right? And the more institutions have bent to their will, the more difficult it'll be for them to accommodate to what others want and what others within their own party might want. So this really will get into, the weeds of how the party organization functions, who the other people are who might try to be checks on them. But like I said, it's a big question depending on the mandate. And it's this in-between scenario, I think, that will throw up a lot of questions of whether the party as an organization has been fundamentally remade in one person's image, or whether other parts of the party can sort of come in to act as a check to them, you know.
Thank you, Pavitra. I can see several excellent questions have come in on the chat, but I wanted to squeeze in one or two of my own before we move to the audience questions. Ambassador Sybil, if I can return to you and some of the points you said at the start. I mean, there does seem to be a high degree of policy continuity between governments across the political spectrum, at least from a foreign policy perspective. But my question is, to what degree does the BJP's Hindutva ideology matter from a foreign policy perspective? I mean, we've seen under the current government, there's been more of an effort to promote India as a civilizational state. These references to India as a Vishwamitra, or a friend to the world, or a Vishwa Guru, or teacher of the world. The BJP manifesto refers to India as a Vishwa Bandhu as well. But, you know, my question is, to what extent does the nature of the ideology of the government matter in the formulation of India's foreign policy?
Well, you know, earlier on you said that you would like people to give short replies, but I find that they have given such lengthy replies that no space has been left for me to give my views, even on the subjects, on the questions that you asked the two other panelists. I think they have reflected very well, especially the lady from the LSE, the views of the opposition in India. She's entitled to do so. If she thinks that in 6 weeks in India, she was able to take the pulse of the voters and come to very definitive conclusions, so be it. We will know on June 4 what the actual results of the elections would be. But with regard to all the points that she mentioned, not that they are irrelevant, but this is precisely what the Congress is saying. And then we'll see how the public reacts to the charges that the Congress and the opposition are making, and how they will finally vote. The other is that the point is being made that somehow the Indian democracy is in danger of some sort, but at the same time, there is this contradictory view that has been expressed that the election is going to be very competitive. Now, you can't have it both ways. If the election is going to be very competitive, then the fact that the press has been muzzled and the institutions have been muzzled and an institutional takeover and everything else, there is an inherent contradiction in this. With regard to Reporters Sans Frontières, first of all, let me tell you that there are 148,000 registered newspapers in India and 300 magazines. I would like the panelists to mention one country in the world which has such a large base of media. But other than that, it is ridiculous that anybody should quote the Reporters Sans Frontières, because I looked at their report and they rate Iraq, Egypt, Mozambique, Togo, Burkina Faso, Mali, Syria, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Sudan, North Korea, Congo, as having more press freedom, and Myanmar, of all countries, as having more press freedom than India. So much for the objectivity of these reporters. So far as restrictions on funding from foreign organizations are concerned, I think the government is doing very well, because this is the standard tool that the West has used for regime change elsewhere. And we have to be very cautious in a highly diverse society where we have a lot of social and religious fault lines, that we do not allow foreign funding to come in and make things worse and more difficult for us. You see what's happening in Georgia. I mean, the law that they made is actually much softer than the US law itself. That only if a foreign Georgian organizations gets more than 20% of its funding from abroad, then it has to be declared a foreign agent. And you find there is such a massive upsurge prompted by others, including 3 European foreign ministers landing up in Georgia to agitate against the law. Sheer interference in the internal affairs of Georgia. So we have to be very careful about these things. And now, with regard to the press, now Suhasini Haidar's own paper, The Hindu, or the Indian Express or the Caravan or so many other magazines. They are lashing out at government day after day. They're abusing Prime Minister. Even Rahul Gandhi himself, the kind of things that he's saying about the Prime Minister. You mentioned Kharge. All these things are being said openly. In fact, Rahul Gandhi is determined to provoke a social conflict in India, a caste conflict in India. This has been the theme of his press statements and his public statements all over the country, and he's saying it. And Prime Minister answered this question about using the agencies. He said, well, only 2 or 3% of the people who've been targeted by these agencies are politicians, the rest are not politicians. And if Kejriwal is implicated in some kind of a scam, well, why should he go scot-free? Anyway, leave that aside. To come back to your question about whether Hindutva is going to affect India's foreign policy. In fact, the biggest success of Modi's foreign policy has been with the Gulf states. These are Islamic states, traditionally very conservative. He went there and actually inaugurated for the first time a magnificent Hindu temple in the UAE. Now, the Gulf states are not buying this propaganda, which is being made internally, although I might say that there may be some element of truth in this in terms of some sharpening of religious tensions in India, but that's a different debate. But in terms of foreign policy and how the Islamic countries are looking at India, this key Islamic countries, this is not an issue at all in terms of our foreign policy. Bangladesh has a lot of extremist elements in the country, but yet you see our relations with Bangladesh, probably the best that we have ever had with Bangladesh. In terms of our general neighborhood, I don't think there's any problem, whether it's Nepal or Sri Lanka. I think they relate very well to the cultural connections between the two countries, to the religious connections between the two countries. There's no problem there at all. In the case of Maldives, I think the China factor is far more important, though there is an Islamic factor there. With regard to the West in general, if you see the kind of relationship Modi has built with Western leaders, whether it is Biden himself, whether it is Macron in France, whether it's the Nordic states, or any of the countries that he has visited where he has been feted, I don't think this is the press. Yes, it's the press, the Western press that is consistently targeting India, constantly targeting India. And it's the same theme. It's an orchestrated thing because they all say the same thing. And they say what the Indian opposition is saying against Modi and the BJP. And this, as you've seen in recent months, the kind of orchestration that is in the Western media against India and Hindutva and everything else. So, look, there's a lot of talk about this human rights and this and that, about maltreatment of Muslims in India. Look at what the West is doing. How many Muslims have they killed in Iraq and Libya and Syria? How many? I mean, they should be a little, and how many Muslims are being killed in the Gaza Strip? And the West is totally supporting Israel, at least the United States is. And here they pick up issues in India as if their own hands are very clean. I think that we have to have a little more objectivity when it comes to criticism like this. All is not well in India. Of course, it can't be. 1.4 billion people, such diverse society, so many fractures within the country. Managing the country is extremely difficult. But all governments try and do their best. And the problems cannot be totally addressed, fully addressed to the satisfaction of everything. You've seen what's happening to democracies in United States and in Europe. They are in big trouble. They can't even manage their small minorities. In fact, now I read somewhere that after Iraq, the worst place in terms of social strife is Sweden. They're not able to absorb their minorities. Look at the right-wing elements, fascist parties that have grown in Germany and elsewhere. So I think we have to take a holistic view rather than be carried forward by personal prejudices and propaganda.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibal. I see we've got lots of questions that have come in, so I'm going to see if I can try and respond to some of these. There's one question that's come in on the situation that we see in the world today of rising global blocs. And so I wanted to ask, India has really been very much in a geopolitical sweet spot of sorts. It's been a beneficiary of tensions in the US-China relationship to a degree, given the push to de-risk or diversify supply chains away from China. It's managed to have relations with both Moscow and Washington, despite the war in Ukraine. It's able to maintain relations with both Iran and Israel in the context of the conflict in Gaza. So my question is this really sustainable, in a world of growing geopolitical rivalry and polarization? So perhaps you first, Ambassador Sibal, and then Suhasini.
Of course it is sustainable. I don't see any problem in that. I mean, look at United States of America. It has never really chosen between India and Pakistan. It has fluctuated, very, very supportive of Pakistan and supportive of India, but now going back to supporting Pakistan. They're keeping their options open. With regard to China, they're keeping their options open. The largest trade partner is China, and they're engaging China at very high level. So many high-level US leaders have gone to China. Scholz with his business delegation has gone to China. Macron has received Xi Jinping, this and that. It's not as if they are worried that they have to choose between India and China. No. We also understand that they have to protect their interests. They have certain needs, certain national interests which they have to protect, and it's perfectly all right. I mean, Russia has become very close to China. We are not objecting to that, because we feel Russia has been pushed into the arms of China because of the folly of the West. But that's no reason for us to move away from Russia. We are an Asian country. We have stakes in Asia. We have stakes in Eurasia. We just cannot withdraw from Asia just because we are worried about Russia becoming close to China. We're keeping our doors open to China. Look at our trade with China, $130 billion. We've not clamped down on it, but we have restricted Chinese entry into certain sensitive and critical areas. With Iran, we are maintaining our dialogue. With Israel, our relationship completely altered. We became part of ITU2 and also the India-Europe, Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. We've been doing that and we'll continue to do that. And as we rise economically, as we grow economically, as we become stronger, we will be able to pursue this policy even more, rather than less. We don't have to choose between this side or that side. We have to look after our national interests, which we will do.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibal. Suhasini, I'd also like you to comment on this. And there have also been several questions that have come in on China, which I'd welcome your thoughts on. I mean, the relationship seems to have been put in a new normal since 2020, since the Galwan Valley clashes. I mean, do you see any possibility of a return or a reset to the pre-2020 status quo, where both sides essentially agree to shelve the border dispute and work and deepen relations and other aspects of the bilateral relationship? Or has that ship really sailed, in your opinion? You're muted, Suhasini.
I think, honestly speaking, the situation in 2020, regardless of whether the government admits it here or not, was created when the Chinese moved troops into areas claimed by India. Essentially, there are 7 spots at which the Chinese troops were mobilized. And of those 7, 5 have seen some kind of a détente already in the last 4 years. 2 remain. In this point, we have heard many tough statements coming from the External Affairs Minister, the Defense Minister. The Prime Minister has not said it. The Prime Minister began in 2020 by saying no one's come inside Indian territory, no inch of Indian territory has gone to anyone, and nor is any military in Indian territory. So, of course, the question has been, well, then why, has India taken the tough stand it has in terms of not keeping any high-level meetings going. But despite all of this, I do believe that what the Prime Minister has been trying to do is push for a détente. So whether it was his desire to put his hand out to Mr. Xi Jinping in Indonesia on the sidelines of a G20 dinner, or whether it was in BRICS in South Africa, where there was some kind of an informal meeting between the two, although they differed on what they had agreed about. there has been that kind of desire, possibly both in Delhi and Beijing, to try and see some kind of a date on. I have no doubt that when the elections are over, the new government will, or the newly elected government will, of course, want to try and take this bad situation somewhere. If Prime Minister Modi is re-elected, he has himself said in an interview this month that it is an important relationship, that he does not, that he thinks that this is a serious situation between the two countries, and that he hopes to see a very speedy resolution to the problems India and China have. So I have no doubt that if he is re-elected, there will be some kind of push for some kind of for a détente. Obviously, right at the start, there has to be the rider that until Chinese troops move back from where they are, it will be very difficult for any government in New Delhi to sell to the rest of India any kind of a sort of peaceful settlement with China.
Thanks, Suhasini. I also see several questions have come in on the UK-India relationship, and perhaps I can use my prerogative as chair to try and answer this question. I'm happy for others to also weigh in. So I think Foreign Minister Jaishankar said it best when he was visiting London last Diwali. He referred to quote unquote unrealized potential in the bilateral relationship and the need to seek new convergences. I think there has been far too much emphasis on the historical bonds of a common language or legal system, or the so-called living bridge of the diaspora community. And I think there's need for seeking new areas of convergence, so whether it be in the areas of education, defense, technology, India's interest in playing a leadership role in the global south, or the complementarity of the UK's special relationship with the US and the India's deepening strategic cooperation with the US. I think the key watch point will obviously be the UK election. I think there will be a high degree of continuity under a potential Labour government. And the other, of course, important watch point is the FTA negotiations that are ongoing. The 14th round of negotiations, I believe, have been on hold, but they have been ongoing. And I think consensus has been reached on most of the 26 chapters. But I think the UK's engagement with India also needs to be looked at through the broader prism of the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt towards, they tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. And on that front, there's also challenges, fiscal constraints on the UK government. There's obviously other foreign policy priorities, the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and reviving relations with the EU. So I think that those are my 2 cents on the UK-India relationship. There's been an interesting question that's been posed on the role of the diaspora community. So I think perhaps Pavitra, as the sole member of the panel who's sitting outside India, it would be interesting to get your insights. I mean, it seems to me it's a double-edged sword. We've seen a very warm welcome that Prime Minister Modi has received from overseas Indian communities when visiting US, Australia, UK, elsewhere. But also the flip side of that is what we've seen in the India-Canada relationship over the last year, that when groups are engaged in activities that challenge India's status or sovereignty, that it can be a thorn in the bilateral relationship. But I welcome your thoughts on that.
I want to go back to connecting this to something that Suhasini said earlier, which is, the world is in a funny place right now with strongman dynamics emerging in multiple countries around the planet. And there was a very interesting report over the past couple of years done by Sumitra Badrinathan, Milan Vaishnav, and Devesh Kapoor that study Indian Americans' views on both domestic and international politics. And here you see a very interesting trend. In the United States, the Indian community, the second generation that can vote, or those who have gotten the vote, tend to be overwhelmingly democratic and anti-strongman efforts by then President Donald Trump, while at the same time appreciating that same strongman tactics back in India under Prime Minister Modi. And so there are some tensions here about what the diaspora abroad really is. Within its own context, like the United States, the diaspora tends to be extremely liberal and tends to be very sort of liberal leaning in its proclivities for voting, and yet have very different views on what it must be, what it should be back home in India. And these are interesting emerging contradictions in how the Indian diaspora thinks. Having said that, I think there's also been a sort of diminishing of the support for the contemporary BJP as it stands over the years. I think there was much more, rah-rah change in 2014 to 2019 to now. I think there's a sort of fatigue that this government now has had 10 years and that we could see different things, right? And the campaign itself, I think over the last few weeks, with the sort of rhetoric that's been happening in the electoral field, Suhasini mentioned the number of times the Prime Minister has gone on the offensive against minorities. I think these kinds of things don't really sit well with the diaspora. And so I think there's a mixed bag here of a diaspora that wants to see India thriving and develop, and wants to see it take its rightful place in the world, while at the same time being a little bit cautious about the rhetoric of the contemporary government, which sits oddly with its own political choices in its new environments like the United States or UK.
Thank you, Pavitra. And just perhaps staying with you, there's also been a few questions that are posed on the issue of constitutional changes or possible constitutional changes. Obviously, that will very much depend on the degree of the mandate that if the BJP returns to power. So I think I welcome your thoughts on that. I mean, there's been talk of potential concerns of a growing centralization of power, this one nation, one election slogan that's been we've heard from the government. So what are your thoughts on the issue of potential constitutional changes that we could see in the pipeline?
I want to say a couple of things about this. The first is to connect it back to what Ambassador Sibal said earlier. How is it possible to have competitive elections and yet have democratic backsliding? And I think, this is something I teach my Intro to Comparative Politics students, that you can have a thriving electoral autocracy without any of the checks and balances that go with an effective functioning democracy, right? So what would an overwhelming majority in the contemporary BJP lead to? Well, they've wanted to very clearly push on, this idea of one nation, one elections, which is to synchronize federal elections with state level elections. And the idea there is that that would give an advantage to national level parties. So if I was a national level party wanting to consolidate my power, that's exactly how I would be thinking, right? The second is, this idea of how to think about who the redistributive, beneficiaries of the state are. And here, I think, at least from what I understand from recent pieces in the press and from reports on the ground, the idea of constitutional changes have really rattled some of the new groups that have given their support to BJP in recent elections. So if you think about, scheduled castes and OBCs who have come on board to support the BJP in recent years, have gotten rattled at the idea that constitutional changes might mean an abandoning of long-standing reservations for some of these groups. So I think the constitutional change possibility is actually filtered into electoral politics this time round. And again, we'll see whether that has really worked or not in the coming week when the results are out. But I think there are three things to watch for. The first is, we have not done a census for the first time since 1871. Even after partition, we managed to do a census, right? We have put a census on hold. And when the census comes back, it'll be the basis of a new electoral delimitation exercise, which could now greatly privilege the Hindi heartland compared to some of the other states in the country. And if that does so, that would be a strategic move on the part of the party to consolidate power in parts of the country where it is already powerful. The second thing to watch is how much a renewed mandate or victory for the BJP might incline it to go after reservations. And the third thing to watch out is how much does some of the changes it's already brought in terms of the Citizenship Amendment Act, or changes to Kashmir, how it alters what it means to constitutionally be an Indian in a pluralistic secular society. So I think those three things are open questions, and again, will depend on how big a mandate this government achieves in the coming elections.
Thanks, Pavitra. I actually wanted to pick up on a point that you said towards the end, and again, linking it to the issue of foreign policy, and that's on Pakistan. So you mentioned the special status of Kashmir being revoked Article 370, but I've been surprised by how surprisingly stable the relationship between India and Pakistan has been. Of all the countries that Pakistan actually shares borders with, the border with India has been the most stable in recent years, arguably. You could see we've seen the recent border skirmishes with Iran and Afghanistan. While the ceasefire along the line of control has largely held in place, despite the increasingly confrontational rhetoric that we see coming from both countries. So perhaps, both to Ambassador Sibal and Suhasini, I'd welcome your thoughts on, how do you see the relationship evolving after the election? Do you see any potential, de-escalation pathways, for instance, the reinstatement of statehood for Jammu and Kashmir, National Assembly elections. Ambassador Sybil, if you'd like to go first, and then Suhasini, I'll turn to you.
Well, I think the Prime Minister and other leaders have been saying that the right time they will restitute the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir. They've said that, and they will do it. Now, when they'll do it, I can't say. Maybe after he wins the elections, he might do it. With regard to Pakistan, Prime Minister said in a recent interview that he is not really interested in focusing on Pakistan, that he's locked up his mind on this issue, and that Pakistan do what it seeks to do in terms of managing its own internal issues, that India is not going to pay too much attention to Pakistan. So I don't think that there's going to be any particular move in favor of some kind of restitution of dialogue with Pakistan. And Pakistan also is not giving any indications that it is willing to change some fundamentals of its policies. And Prime Minister has said that, look, we are moving far ahead of Pakistan, and we don't want to get essentially bogged down in this India-Pakistan issue. So that is one aspect. The other is with regard to the stability of the border. It is more a result of Pakistan's own domestic, very serious domestic issues, whether they are economic or political, and what you rightly mentioned, the problems with Afghanistan, which has been a huge setback for Pakistan's foreign policy. There have been actual violence on that border. So for Pakistan to open a second front on the India-Pakistan border in the present circumstances, when they're looking for also IMF assistance and everything else, would be suicidal. So I think it is more a function of the situation in Pakistan and the difficulties Pakistan is in, rather than any substantive change in mindset in Pakistan, which would then be reciprocated by India, and which should be reciprocated by India if that really happens. But I want to say something about the CAA. I don't know why even experts who are looking at India persist in giving false information with regard to the CAA. CAA is not amended the citizenship, and so far as Indian citizenship is concerned, it's only expediting the acquisition of Indian citizenship by refugees from the neighboring countries. And there is a cutoff date for that. And after that, even those people will not get any advantage in terms of an accelerated path to citizenship. But yet, the propaganda has got so deeply ingrained in the minds of people who are diaspora, people who are studying India, that they just don't want to recognize the reality of the situation with regard to one election at the state level, at the national level. Why impute these kind of motives? Actually, people like us feel very frustrated that that India is in election mode all the time. One state after another state, and the Prime Minister is running from one state to another. The election machinery is getting involved. So much national resources are being wasted in this. The other things that the Prime Minister and the leaders have to do rather than fighting elections all the time, all over the country. But there has to be a consensus on this. It just cannot be done because the BJP wants it. Constitutional amendment in India is extremely difficult. For heaven's sake, look at the manner in which India's constitution can be amended. It's not as simple as it's being made out. We have to have a majority in Rajya Sabha firstly, and secondly, of course, your 2/3 of the states or 3/4, whatever it is, also have to vote in favor. And insofar as the census is concerned, it was explained that because of COVID, it could not take place. And the Prime Minister addressed this issue. I mean, the BJP is not foolish. They're going to create a North versus South divide in India. He's been bending backwards, actually, showing enormous respect to Tamil Nadu in various ways in order to stem the tendencies that we've seen, separatist tendencies in Tamil Nadu in the past, and the policies of the present government. So he's bending backwards to make the southern part of India as part of our national ethos in every possible way. We're not going to do something which actually sharpens the North-South divide and then leads to a potential breakup of India. So I think some of these canards about what the BJP may or may not want to do is just deeply felt anti-Modi feelings, which parts of our diaspora have.
Thank you. Is there any possibility even only Nixon could go to China moment on the India-Pakistan relationship? If we have Modi come back with a strengthened mandate and his Hindutva credentials, does that offer any opening for any outreach or rapprochement in the India-Pakistan relationship?
I would say I would disagree with Ambassador Sybil. I think this government is already in touch with the powers that be in Pakistan in terms of what can constitute some kind of a détente post-elections. After all, both countries have come through elections this year. The truth is, when we talk about the LOC ceasefire of 2021, that came together at a time when India felt very vulnerable. It was just 6 months after that terrible clash with Chinese troops, in which at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed. And we had to move, India had to move battalions across from the line of control with Pakistan to the line of actual control with China in order to deal with the situation. So at that time, the LOC ceasefire that came through, that has been consistent since then, more or less, came at a time when both countries needed it. Subsequently, there was this missile misfire that went from India, and we saw back channels being able to stem any kind of response to what could have been a much more bigger conflagration between the two countries. I think Pakistan has its hands full dealing with its internal crises, whether it's the politics, whether it's the economy, whether it's its own, all its indices that are really in trouble, and its problems with its other neighbors. So I think that there are small off-ramps, as you were talking about, in terms of restoring the high commissioners of the two countries, which have not been there since 2019, possibly moving something on trade. We've heard noises from the Pakistani foreign minister on that subject. I don't expect any big breakthroughs, however, with Pakistan. And it really remains to be seen. In this election, we have heard something new in terms of the defense minister, the external affairs minister, the UP chief minister speak very, very strongly about the possibility of India reacquiring that part of Jammu and Kashmir that is under Pakistani control, what's called Pakistan occupied Kashmir here in India. And if there was some kind of a movement to destabilize the LOC in that sense, then it's anyone's guess where that would go. It's certainly been quite startling to hear those comments being made at election rallies in India during this particular campaign. So I would say there's certainly a chance of some kind of opening between the two countries. I wouldn't hazard a guess about how far that could go, though.
Thank you, Suhasini. So I think on that note, we will need to call this event to a close. We will, of course, continue to monitor the Indian election with analysis on its outcome and implications. If you're interested in the work that we're doing on Asia, please keep an eye on the Chatham House website or sign up to the Asia Pacific Program newsletter. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our excellent panel of speakers, Ambassador Kanwal Sybil, Suhasini Haider, and Dr. Pavitra Suryanarayan. Thank you all. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.